June 17th, 1972. 5 men led by E. Howard Hunt, a former CIA officer, and G. Gordon Liddy, a White House lawyer and former FBI agent, working on the campaign to re-elect President Nixon, broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C. Their intention was to wiretap and gather information on the activities of President Nixon's main opponent for the 72 election, the Democratic nominee George McGovern, so they could disrupt his chances to challenge Nixon. During the course of the burglary, the men taped the latches of the doors they opened, from the parking garage to the offices. When security guard Frank Wills removed the tape from the doors, he mostly brushed off the event, until he returned 20 minutes later, when he saw the doors he had removed the tape from had been retaped, prompting him to call the police, citing suspicious circumstances. Alfred Baldwin, the spotter for the burglars, stationed at the Howard Johnson's Hotel, was distracted, watching the film Attack of the Puppet People on TV. As such, he did not see the arrival of the police, or the officers going to investigate the offices. By the time he realized that the police was there and radioed the burglars, it was too late. All 5 men were caught in the act and arrested. Initially not understanding the reasons for their actions, over the next 2 years it would come to light that this political espionage went all the way up the Republican Party, and to Richard Nixon himself. Despite Nixon's landslide victory in the 72 election, this scandal, added on to the rapid failure of the conflict that was Vietnam, would see Nixon resign after impeachment, and the subsequent threat of removal, which would see the American establishment shaken to its core. The American public's perception of its government had completely shifted, added on to the Pentagon Papers released in 1971, showing that the US was lying about how big the scope of the Vietnam War truly was. So when Americans went to the polls in 1976 with the fallout of the Vietnam War still fresh in their minds to vote for either the Republican candidate Gerald Ford, the vice president under Nixon, an unelected incumbent who pardoned Nixon for his crimes in the Watergate scandal, or the Democratic candidate Jimmy Carter, who had been untainted by the scandals in Washington and who ran on the platform of reforming the political system, the American public chose Carter in a close race. This would be the start of the Carter years and begin a shift in the American system.
What Carter had that his opponents did not was the acceptance and support of elite sectors of the mass communications media. It was their favorable coverage of Carter and his campaign that gave him an edge, propelling him rocket-like to the top of the opinion polls. This helped Carter win key primary election victories, enabling him to rise from an obscure public figure to president-elect in the short space of 9 months.
The election of 1976 was seen as a shift in American politics to some, but to others it would only be a continuation of the same system. The Republicans had lost favor and the establishment had been shaken to its core. But that doesn't mean that Carter was opposed to the establishment who had long supported Nixon. Besides a few gestures given towards minorities, the poor, and human rights abroad, he would remain within the boundaries of the American political system. The peanut farmer and one-time governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, was seen by prominent groups within the establishment, such as the Trilateral Commission,
a private international organization composed of wealthy, powerful, and well-connected individuals from the advanced capitalist trilateral world: North America, Western Europe, and Japan,
as the right choice to back, given that the Watergate-plagued Republican Party was a sure loser. This allowed for positive media coverage and support from the establishment going into Carter's presidency. In order to repair America's reputation abroad and at home, after Vietnam and the Watergate Crisis of the early 70s, Carter pushed US allies in the Cold War, such as the apartheid state of South Africa and the Chilean dictatorship, to liberalize. Further pushes for economic liberalization, such as the handover of the Panama Canal Zone to the Noriega US-backed dictatorship, were made, with the outward view of trying to just a wrong, with the New York Times saying, "We stole it and removed the incriminating evidence from our history books." However, the reality was that the canal had lost its military importance, as it could no longer accommodate large tankers or aircraft carriers. However, the treaty handing back the canal left vague language that could be used as a basis for military intervention, should U.S. economic interests ever be threatened in the region. Despite this switch in stance towards ensuring a stronger human rights record, the Carter administration still supported groups such as the Nicaraguan dictatorship under Anastasia Somoza, despite the popularity of the revolution against him, or Carter asking for $5.7 million for the El Salvador military junta fighting off its own popular peasant rebellion, after President Marcos of the Philippines imprisoned 10 of the 21 losing opposition candidates, tortured prisoners, and killed civilians. Carter still urged Congress to give Marcos $300 million in military aid for the next 5 years. This all led to a realization by the Carter administration, saying to Congress, a number of countries with deplorable records of human rights observance are also countries where we have an important security and foreign policy interests. These interests abroad are conflated and mixed into the Cold War era, with fears that popular revolutions in Latin America and Asia would remove American influence by removing known pro-American leaders and replacing them with unknown actors. Now, these are the less talked about foreign policies of the Carter administration. The most talked about, however, were his actions in resolving the state of war that had existed between Egypt and Israel since the 6 Days War and the Israeli occupation of the Sinai. Carter held the Camp David Accords, which saw the creation of the framework for peace in the Middle East, which saw Israel give back the Sinai in return for Egyptian recognition of the State of Israel. This also saw a UN rejection of the Accords, as while it planned to set up autonomy for the Palestinian people in the next 5 years, it did not include the right of return and the right of national independence and sovereignty in Palestine, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, and that such talks determining this must include the PLO as well. Perhaps Carter's most well-known foreign policy activity was his support for the Iranian Shah. The Iranian Shah's torture of dissidents against his rule was not only known by the Carter administration, but it was also perpetrated with the help of the CIA. The 1979 revolt against the Shah was a popular massive revolution covering a wide tent of groups, ideologies, and faiths, from socialists fed up with the Shah's support of foreign business interests, to Shia fundamentalists who were upset with the progressive cultural reforms under the Shah. This revolt, added with the Shah's failing health, led to the collapse of the US-friendly government, and made the Shah a political refugee in the US. On November 4, 1979, the US Embassy in Tehran was overrun by militant students, who demanded the return of the Shah to Iran in return for the release of the 52 embassy employees. This crisis would last for 14 months and would dominate the last quarter of the Carter presidency, shifting policy and views about Carter and his administration, impacting both foreign and domestic policy.
The special report that we planned to bring you tonight was about domestic politics, the battle among the Democrats. But we think the crisis in Iran is more urgent right now than the campaign here at home. Some 60 Americans, including our fellow citizen whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
The Iranian hostage crisis would drastically affect American society and shift the overall psyche of the nation. One of the more immediate impacts to be felt from this crisis would be the 1979 oil crisis. To understand the impact this would have on America as a whole, and how this would impact Carter's presidency, I'm gonna have to apologize, because we're going to have to talk about oil prices on the international market. A decrease in oil production caused by striking oil workers in 1978, added on to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, would see a 4 to 5% loss in oil production on the international market. Despite this relatively small decrease, the oil market reacted violently, causing panic among crude oil buyers, exacerbating the crisis, with oil barrels going from $13 a barrel in mid-1979 to $34 a barrel in mid-1980. This, added with the 1980 Iran-Iraq War, would lead to a decrease in oil production on the international stage and would cause recession and exacerbate stagnation at home. This crisis would also lead towards a wish for more energy independence within the US and other non-OPEC nations, seeing production of crude oil increase by an additional 5.6 million barrels of crude oil per day in non-OPEC nations from 1979 to 1985. OPEC would respond to this by drastically cutting production of oil, limiting the amount of oil being produced to 18 million barrels of oil per day compared to the previous 31 million height pre-Iranian Revolution. This crisis would see a major shift in energy policy towards renewables and renewable research. The Iranian oil crisis would spearhead this shift towards alternatives, with Carter saying while dedicating new solar panels being placed on the roof of the White House,
"Today, in directly harnessing the power of the sun, we are taking the energy that God gave us, the most renewable energy that we will ever see, using it to replace our dwindling supplies of fossil fuels."
Now, this shift was primarily due to the energy crisis at hand, but can also be seen at the same time as one of the first actions of actual climate policy being implemented by a major nation. This would see a significant increase in renewable research. The oil crisis and economic stagflation led to little improvements in the quality of life for the average person. However, wealth among the rich was increasing. This would be heightened after Carter, but under this period we would see a growth in corporate profits. American corporations had spread all over the world through the 60s and 70s, and were active in every continent. However, these relationships between the corporations and the nations and people living within these nations were not always equal. This can be seen clearly in the difference in profits versus investments in many of these regions. In Europe, for instance, between 1950 to 1965, US corporations invested a total of $8.1 billion and made $5.5 billion in profits. Compare this to Latin America during the same time, where US corporations invested $3.8 billion but made $11.2 billion in profit. Or even further with Africa during this period, investing $5.2 billion but making $14.3 billion in profits. In a classic imperial situation where a colonial power takes more resources than they provide, you have a colonial system. When corporations do the same, you have neocolonialism. No longer state authority, but economic power dictates the exchange in this system. Now, this system was not created under the Carter administration, but an increase in corporate profits would happen under the Carter years that would rapidly grow until this day. While corporations were seeing record profits, Carter could only weakly propose benefits for the poor. 1 in 7 children in America had no known source of health care. 1 in 3 children had never even seen a dentist. Maureen Wright Edelman, the director of the Children's Defense Fund, stated in an op-ed for the New York Times,
"The Senate Budget Committee recently knocked off $88 million from a modest $288 million administration request to improve the program that screens and treats children's health problems. At the same time, the Senate found $725 million to bail out Litton Industries to hand to the Navy at least 2 destroyers ordered by the Shah of Iran."
The government's focus on foreign policy and corporate profits over domestic issues was not lost on many Americans, however. In a Gallup poll taken January 23rd of 1976, a plurality of those polled, 36%, said that too much is being spent on the military, partially having to do with Vietnam syndrome and the fall of South Vietnam a year prior. However, minus an uptick during and after the Iranian hostage crisis, on November 11, 1982, 41% of Americans thought that too much was being spent on the military. During the Reagan years, without even the faint liberalism of Carter, this number would reach a majority on January 7th of 1990 of 50% under Bush Sr., but we'll get to that in the future. Carter made some effort to hold on to social programs, but this was undermined greatly by an increasing military budget and a slate of tax reforms, whose primary benefactors were the wealthy. Economist Robert Lechman, writing in The Nation, noted that there was a 44% increase in corporate profits in the last quarter of 1978, and responded to this saying,
"Perhaps the president's most outrageous act occurred last November, when he signed into law an $18 billion tax reduction, the bulk of whose benefits accrue to affluent individuals and corporations."
This goes to show that while Carter and his administration did make some attempts at economic reform and policy reform as a whole, his administration was more focused on maintaining the course, and was content with small concessions to labor and social movements, rather than major changes as a whole. This would appear to many Americans to be nothing but stagnation and an unchanging system with new foreign failures, such as the new Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, or the Iranian hostage crisis and the subsequent oil crisis, and economic recession, primarily impacting everyday people. These increases in tax cuts and increase in corporate profits saw an opportunity and a new breath of air for the Conservative Party, more than happy to throw off the image of Watergate in Vietnam. This left Carter open to a challenge in the 1980 election. This left him open to Reagan.
symptoms of this crisis of the American spirit are all around us. For the first time in the history of our country, a majority of our people believe that the next 5 years will be worse than the past 5 years. 2/3 of our people do not even vote. The productivity of American workers is actually dropping. And the willingness of Americans to save for the future has fallen below that of all other people in the Western world.
In the summer of 1973, Mohammed Daoud, the former Prime Minister of Afghanistan, launched a successful coup against the King of Afghanistan, King Zahir. Daoud's ideology tended to be more nationalist than it was socialist, but despite this, Daoud was able to find success in his coup. Through help from Soviet aid and with the backing of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA. Throughout the 70s, Daoud would shift his overall policy towards a more middle-of-the-road approach, in order to appeal to both the American and Soviet camps. This shift from the Soviet camp towards a non-aligned approach would anger factions of the now split PDPA, and on April 28th of 1978, a split faction of the PDPA, led by Nuru Taraki, would assault the presidential palace and execute Daoud and his family in the Sour Revolution. Taraki would then become the new prime minister a few days later, shifting Afghan policy closer in line with Moscow. On December 5th of 1978, the Soviets and Taraki Afghan government signed a friendship treaty, which included provisions that would allow for direct Soviet military assistance should an Islamic insurgency threaten the regime. The Taraki regime, which is mainly focused in Kabul's main objective was to spread the communist revolution to the Islamic tribes outside of Kabul. Following the murder of political opponents ordered by Deputy Prime Minister Hafizullah Amin, a longtime ally of Taraki and the regime's strongman, in order to consolidate power in response to a plot to overthrow the Taraki regime by former Daoud supporters led by Babrak Karmal. This purge, combined with the spreading of communist ideology to Islamic tribes, would be met with armed revolt in Afghanistan. By mid-1979, the USSR was looking to replace the failing Taraki regime and dispatched combat troops to Bagram Air Base outside of Kabul. This would prompt Carter to send non-lethal military aid to these Islamic insurgents, who would come to be known as the Mujahideen, a collection of Islamic tribes of various beliefs, ideologies, and objectives. Amin, the deputy prime minister, saw this Soviet support towards Taraki, combined with his own internal power struggle with Taraki, causing Amin's forces to depose and later execute Taraki in a coup in October of 1979. This angered the Soviets, who would then invade, overthrow, and kill Amin on Christmas Eve of 1979, and replace him with Babrak Karmal, who would be installed as a Soviet puppet. This, along with the Iranian Revolution, would prompt the Carter administration to establish its own doctrine in regards to the Middle East, called the Carter Doctrine, along with boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics, with Carter saying,
"Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America. Such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force."
These events would have a major impact on Carter's re-election campaign in 1980, especially once the economy fell into a recession and the Iranian hostage crisis began. On November 4th of 1979, students in Tehran invaded the U.S. Embassy and took 66 Americans hostage. 6 Americans in the embassy were able to escape and flee to the Canadian and Swedish embassies, where they were then given fake Canadian passports and smuggled out of the country with the help of the CIA. Now, on November 19th and 20th, one of the leading figures of the revolution, and the soon-to-be supreme leader of Iran, Ruhollah Khomeini, ordered the release of all African Americans and women taken hostage, under the belief they were unlikely to be spies. Later in July of 1980, one more hostage would also be released, due to illness which would later be diagnosed as multiple sclerosis. This brings us down to our number for the rest of the crisis, 52 hostages held by Iranian students in the US Embassy. After a failed rescue attempt on April 24th of 1980 left 5 US Air Force service members and 3 US Marines dead in an aircraft collision, an attempt at a rescue of the hostages through military intervention was called off. This would greatly impact Carter's chances for the 1980 election, even further with the crisis dominating the election cycle, with its opposition making him out to be an incompetent leader who couldn't be tasked to deal with what needed to be properly done. As such, the Republican candidate for the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, an actor before that, was able to utilize this crisis, the subsequent economic and oil crisis in Afghanistan, to throw off the association Republicans had with Watergate. Due to a very low turnout for the 1980 election and a politically apathetic general population, Reagan was able to combine conservative factions such as big business, fundamentalists, and religious groups to help win the 1980 election, starting the Reagan years. There have been some claims that Reagan allegedly helped to stall the Iranian hostage crisis until after the 1980 election in order to improve his election chances, preventing a so-called October surprise that could have resulted in a Carter victory. Accurate or not, the fact remained that Carter was out of office, removing the faint liberalism of his administration and replacing him with a new hardline conservatism, focused on prioritizing business interests. So what is the takeaway from this? The Carter presidency started because of shifting elite interests and ended much the same way. Can Carter truly be called a reformer? Or is the term mitigator more accurate? A mitigator of genuine anger at a system that had proven to be corrupt under Nixon, a system that showed it couldn't be trusted, evident in Vietnam, and a system that showed it could not adapt to crisis as shown through Iran. To definitively say what the impacts of the Carter presidency were, we will have to go further. We will have to go into the changed Republican Party and how Republicans shifted after Vietnam and the Watergate Crisis. But in order to do this, we will have to go into a figure mentioned before, whose modern legacy is as relevant as it is controversial. We will have to go into the presidency of Ronald Wilson Reagan.